Statements by ministers. Government notices of motion. Introduction of bills. The honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm introducing this bill on behalf of the member from Annapolis. Big lead to introduce a bill, an act to repeal Chapter 11 of the Acts of 2005, the Petroleum Products Pricing Act.
The honourable member for Annapolis begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Repeal Chapter 11 of the Acts of 2005, the Petroleum Products Pricing Act.
Bill number 134, entitled An Act to Repeal Chapter 11 of the Acts of 2005, the Petroleum Products Pricing Act.
Order the bill be read at a second time on a future day. Notices of motion. Orders of the day. Oral questions put by members to ministers. The time is now 9:14 and we will finish at 10:44. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Bowater pitted worker against worker, neighbour against neighbour. Mr. Speaker, the Premier says that this company must keep costs down to stay competitive in a declining market, Mr. Speaker. They've already cut 100 jobs. They've already forced concessions from the workforce. Every Nova Scotian is already going to subsidize the power through their power bills. And the members of the municipality are going to pay more on their taxes, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Premier, did the Premier get any guarantees from Bowater that more people will not be laid off after he turns over $50 million?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the agreement set out with Bowater calls for the operation of both of the paper machines that are located in the Bowater facility. The agreement calls for the renewal of that facility, increased efficiency in the plant, lower costs. It is designed to keep the mill operating and, of course, a key part of the economic architecture of the South Shore.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition in his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the question to the Premier has he have a guarantee that more people will not be laid off, and he's unwilling to admit to that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, small businesses around this province are suffering. We still have more than 50 small businesses owed a few $1 million from Swasta, Mr. Speaker. The province put itself ahead of those small businesses and refused to let them collect that money that they were owed. Giving money to small business ensures that money stays in this province, while giving money to Bowater, Mr. Speaker, and the Royal Bank ensures that we see more of our money sent elsewhere. Mr. Speaker, so my question for the Premier, why is the Premier more interested in giving money to Bowater and RBC than compensating these local small entrepreneurs?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, Bowater Mersey has been operating in this province since 1929. It has been a key part of the economy of our province, employing thousands of Nova Scotia families for generations, Mr. Speaker. We stand up on behalf of the people of the South Shore. We invest in that business because it's good for the province of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, he stands up for the people of the South Shore. He's signing a deal that's going to allow $23 million to leave here to go to Quebec, Mr. Speaker, and he's more willing to pay the Royal Bank than he is to pay the small entrepreneurs who are creating jobs from one end of the South Shore to the other. Mr. Speaker, the Premier's solution to this problem was to cut a $50 million check to a company that is laying off 100 Nova Scotian workers, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we're also on the hook for commitments to Nova Scotia Power that made the municipality and the Port of Halifax. This deal could cost as much as $90 million, Mr. Speaker, to the taxpayers of Nova Scotia. So my question to the Premier, what other options did the Premier explore before deciding to give Bowater as much as $90 million of taxpayers' money?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we went through many iterations of possible support in order to ensure that that asset continued as a going concern in our province, because on this side of the House, we're actually concerned about the 2,000 people who are part of the Bowater family and jobs, Mr. Speaker, because we have confidence in our province. And I hope the Leader of the Opposition enjoys his throne of pessimism.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today is the day to talk about the state of the province. We can only imagine what fantasy the Premier will spin in his speech this afternoon on this topic, but for the benefit of this House, the real state of the province is that it is one with among the highest taxes, rising power rates, rising fees that are making life unaffordable for too many families and unworkable for too many businesses. Mr. Speaker, and the Premier's answer to all of that in this House is to introduce risky, job-killing labour laws like we have before us. And so my question to the Premier is, will he do the right thing and admit the truth today about the real state of the province and take responsibility for it?
Honourable the Premier.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, I intend to take full responsibility for where the province of Nova Scotia is, because we are on the right path. We are turning the corner on 20 years of the worst economic conditions put in place in the country, put in place by former governments, Mr. Speaker. We are finally digging ourselves out of the hole we were put in by the former government.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I have to admit, I was wrong, Mr. Speaker. The fantasy actually began just here and now this morning. It didn't even wait for this afternoon. Mr. Speaker, the Premier has chosen to blatantly politicize the agreement around Bowater. It is reported in this morning's Chronicle Herald, and I will table the document. He is quoted as saying, quote, "It is a political issue." That is a shame, Mr. Speaker. It is unacceptable to the families and workers and community members in Queens County who have asked all parties to work together in a nonpartisan fashion. Yet the Premier has decided that it is, after all, a political issue.
Order, please. Order. I know it's early in the morning, but let's have a little bit of civility in here this morning. The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I actually believed all three leaders were sincere when they said that this was an important issue that should be beyond politics, and that's why I raised the point that the Premier said yesterday, in his view, it is a political issue. That is a shame to the families and to the workers and to the community of Queens County and, in fact, the entire South Shore, where the fact of the matter is there are 6,500 people without work. And so my question to the Premier is, will he stop playing politics with issues like this and address the real state of the province in his speech today?
Honourable the Premier.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I'm as shocked as the Leader of the Conservative Party is that a political issue should make its way to the floor of the House of Assembly. But it's here, Mr. Speaker. And if he wants, there's a difference between being political and partisan, Mr. Speaker. If he wants to do the right thing, if he wants to be on the right side of the politics of this issue, he can vote in favour of the bill and support the people of the South Shore.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Premier has just proven my point with that incredibly political answer on such a sensitive issue. Mr. Speaker, today we're addressing the real state of the province, and the fact of the matter is we do have one opportunity before us to get it right. with the shipyard contract. But instead of doing all it takes to prepare, the Premier has chosen this time to bring in first contract arbitration, which everyone who creates jobs in the province tells him will be a job killer. He has driven up power rates, he's raised taxes, he's now ramming the first contract bill through the legislature. It's not going to be a very happy holiday, Mr. Speaker, for these 6,500 families in rural Nova Scotia that are without a job today. And so my question for the Premier is this: will he address the real problems of Nova Scotia in his State of the Province address and stand up for those 6,500 families that are without a job this year?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, with respect to addressing the real problems in Nova Scotia, I intend to spend very little time on the opposition, actually. But what I will do is ensure that people understand the very valuable path that we are on toward a stronger economy, towards job creation, towards a stronger labour force, Mr. Speaker, something that will be good for all Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the economy in rural Nova Scotia is in crisis. If the Premier needs proof, he needs to look no further than Liverpool, Mr. Speaker. The Premier is prepared to spend $50 to $90 million to keep a company afloat in an industry which he concedes is in decline. Mr. Speaker, year-to-date employment and labour force numbers show a decline in regions outside of Halifax. To quote this Premier's own finance department, quote, "The southern region saw unemployment decreases of 2.2% for the first 11 months in 2011. Over the same period in 2010, Mr. Speaker, the labour force decreased by 5%. So my question to the Premier, 1,700 job losses, $50 to $90 million to prop up an industry that the Premier admits is in decline. How many more jobs and how much more money will the Premier spend before he admits the rural economy is in crisis?"
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the simple fact of the matter is that Statistics Canada, which the opposition loved to rely on until this month's numbers came out, says that all of the economic indicators for this province are good. The labour force is increasing. Employment is increasing. Unemployment is down. We have the lowest unemployment in Atlantic Canada, Mr. Speaker. And instead of recognizing that fact, the Leader of the Opposition would rather pit one area of the province against another instead of saying, how do we best take advantage of the strong economy in this province?
Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier is just as delusional in here as he is outside of this place, Mr. Speaker. Year over year, data from rural Nova Scotia shows just as bleak in November as it was in October. Outside of Halifax, Mr. Speaker, most recent data shows in the past year, rural Nova Scotia has lost 6,500 jobs, while 8,200 people left the workforce. The difficulties at Bowater are simply a symptom of an overall fundamental problem that the Premier has yet to acknowledge, let alone address. Our province is simply uncompetitive, and businesses are suffering because the Premier is unwilling to face the harsh reality, Mr. Speaker. My question to the Premier, rural Nova Scotia is suffering and is losing jobs, workers and employers with each passing day. How many jobs must rural Nova Scotia lose before his government addresses the core fundamental problems facing our economy?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, if the Leader of the Opposition had his way, there'd be 2,000 more people out of work down the South Shore right today. Mr. Speaker, we are not going to allow that to happen. Mr. Speaker, we're investing in rural businesses throughout the province from one end to the other, Mr. Speaker. They are working to create jobs. We are working with them to ensure that that happens.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, if the Leader of Opposition had his way, the Premier would have signed a deal that would have made sure that $23 million wouldn't have gone to Quebec. It would have gone into the workers of the South Shore. Mr. Speaker, Cape Breton lost 1,300 jobs last year. The North Shore lost 1,300. The Valley, 2,200, and Southern Nova Scotia lost 1,700, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, outside Halifax, we have a 10.7% unemployment rate. We've raised these issues in the House for weeks, and the Premier refuses to take responsibility. The Premier blames global forces and past government for his government's failings. This Premier, while in opposition, said, and I quote, that is passing the buck was a sign of weak leadership, end of quote. Mr. Speaker, my question, 6,500 job loss over 1 year under this government. When will the Premier live up to the standards of leadership that he demanded from other premiers?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, whether it's Bowater or DSTN in Trenton or supporting things like the Cape Breton Railway so that it's available for economic development, dredging in Sydney Harbour, Mr. Speaker, fibre optic cabling in Cape Breton and in Halifax, Mr. Speaker, all of these are parts of the infrastructure of the province that's being strengthened by this government in order to support a robust economy.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government is forcing through an aggressive form of first contract arbitration that only one other province has. The Premier's got up and said first contract arbitration covers 85% of the population. It's not true. This form covers 4% of the population. We've heard clear evidence that this legislation puts future investment from Michelin at risk and worries Sobeys and Clearwater, two of the largest private sector employers in Nova Scotia. People from around this province have asked this government to at least compromise, and this Premier has refused. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier, will he table evidence to indicate why he thinks the Manitoba model of first contract arbitration is the best model for Nova Scotia?
It's not on this bill. Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I think the Liberal Party still gets funding for research. I'm sure they're capable of doing it. There are, well, yeah, I think they're still capable of doing it, Mr. Speaker. But the simple fact of the matter is that we have decades of experience with first contract across the country. And what it does is it stabilizes the labour relations in the provinces. It assists both employers and employees.
Honourable Member for Yarmouth on his first supplementary.
I'm proud to say at least our researchers give us the truth in our caucus, and this caucus is always proud to stand up and give it to you. Mr. Speaker, it's hard to provide such evidence, which is why the Premier hasn't provided it. We know that current employers are now second-thinking future investment. It is also likely that first contract
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth has the floor, and I will remind the Honourable Member using the word "you" in the chamber is unparliamentary, so please redirect her question with a new word.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier cannot provide that evidence because it's hard to provide such evidence. We know that current employers are now second-thinking future investment in the province. It is also likely that first contract arbitration will make it harder to attract future investment from new employers and to bring new business to Nova Scotia. The Dexter government is already forced to bail out Bowater and cut massive checks to major corporations to entice them to set up in Nova Scotia. With FCA, it will be harder to bring those corporations here. My question to the Premier, how can he argue that this form of first contract arbitration is the best to protect our economy when major employers and academics say it isn't?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as I said before, there's more than 3 decades of experience with first contract arbitration across the province, and in fact, there is no evidence to support what the member has said.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth on his final supplementary.
The Premier hasn't supported any evidence to support what he said, ever. What we do know about the Manitoba model of first contract arbitration, Speaker, is that it results in the highest number of contracts being imposed upon employers. We know that it has twice the decertification rate after first contract. We know that a combination of imposed contracts and increased hostility on second contracts will lead to less stability in the long term, and we know that this model of FCA is the wrong model for Nova Scotia. So my question to the Premier, why will the Premier not compromise to bring forward a form of first contract legislation that will create long-term stability rather than short-term gains for his political friends?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is that over 3 decades of first contract legislation across the country, successive governments, when they came in, did not repeal the legislation that was put forward because they found out that it worked. And I understand that's the position of both the opposition parties.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. In 2006, our now Premier went to Nova Scotians with a petition calling on the government to stop power rate increases until they received help with reducing electric consumption. Mr. Speaker, at that time, average consumption was 700 895 kilowatt hours. Today, 2011, after 2.5 years of his government, the average consumption has risen to 833 kilowatt hours. The real state of the province is that consumption is up, not down, increasing the burden on Nova Scotia families who now have to pay more for each kilowatt hour of electricity. My question to the Premier, why did he mislead all those Nova Scotians then, and why has his government given up on helping Nova Scotia families with their electricity bills?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, quite the opposite, Mr. Speaker. The people who sat in these benches are the champions of the people of Nova Scotia. And, Mr. Speaker, that is why we took the HST off of home energy, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the people of Nova Scotia will have to judge who are their champions when they open their electricity bill every month. Mr. Speaker, in 2006, the average electric bill was $89.08. Today, it is $109.98. The real state of the province is that the government has done nothing but drive up the cost of electricity in this province. So my question to the Premier is this. Does he deny that consumption is up, that the price of electricity is up, and will he admit that he has no plan to help Nova Scotians with their power bills?
There you go. Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, there's no question that energy prices are up, and that's not something that we welcome. In fact, we are working very hard to ensure that Nova Scotians have stable, long-term energy rates, and that is why, Mr. Speaker, we are investing in a renewable electricity plan that will do just that, Mr. Speaker. We look forward as programming continues to come forward from Efficiency Nova Scotia that will help bring down the amount of energy used by consumers. After all, the best way for us to ensure that families aren't paying energy costs that are higher is to ensure that the amount of energy that they actually use comes down. That's the job of Efficiency Nova Scotia, and that is the job that they will do as they continue to develop their programming. Obviously, we look forward to that. But fundamentally, Mr. Speaker, we have higher energy costs because the previous government refused to recognize the necessity of getting off of fossil fuels.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the price of our Mercedes-Benz car is stable. It is no help to the people of Nova Scotia to aim for stabilized electricity prices at a Mercedes-Benz level, but that is what the Premier has just told Nova Scotians he aims to do. The fact of the matter is residents, charities, small businesses and large manufacturers are all facing increases in their power bills in 2012, and those increases are going to continue into the foreseeable future. So I will ask the Premier, will he provide open and transparent information to Nova Scotians about the cost of his government's policies on their electric bill, and let them decide if they need to bite the bullet at a Mercedes-Benz level or not?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, what we seek, of course, if we're going to use the motor vehicle analogy, is a North American-made family car, Mr. Speaker. That is what we are aiming for in terms of a model. That's why we refuse to shackle ourselves to the international fossil fuel market, Mr. Speaker. That was what was done by the previous government. What we are doing is we're getting out of that model of business. And, Mr. Speaker, for the Leader of the Conservative Party to suggest that the people of Nova Scotia would demand a Mercedes-Benz is simply wrong.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on Friday, StatsCan released the most recent employment statistics, and the news is not much better than it was last month. On a year-over-year basis, rural Nova Scotia still lost 6,500 jobs, November to November. Further to that, there was a significant contraction of the job market. Yet we have a government that has no interest in moving the economy forward with real targets and measurable outcomes for the money we spend, the taxpayers' money we spend in economic development. Rather, we turn to marketing campaigns and band-aid solutions. So my question, will the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism abandon his approach to economic development of one-off grants and band-aid loans?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've said here since the House opened for this session is that we have a government for the first time in 20 years that's very concerned about jobs. Mr. Speaker, I tabled a newspaper clipping yesterday with respect that the only province in Canada that has had any significant turnaround in the positive side was Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to read another piece of information for the House, Mr. Speaker, and again, this is from the Cape Breton Post. And Mr. Speaker, this is with respect to a group of individuals who are economists and demographic that met at the convention center. They recognize that it's going to take a lot to turn the so-called economic ship around. But what it does say, turning, and I quote, Mr. Speaker, turning that ship requires all hands on deck. And like it or not, Cape Breton is on board. Business need to invest in people, in facilities. Governments need to make policies that encourage residents and business owners to stay and spend money here. And they need to invest in the right infrastructure. And you know what? It says, Mr. Speaker, if the cards all fall the right way and we stay the course, Nova Scotia...
Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. I will not have members in the chamber hollering at another member to sit down. Okay? Order, please. Would the honourable member table that and finish your answer, please?
If all the cards all fall in the right way, and if we stay the course, Nova Scotia and Cape Breton should be able to swing around without hitting any major obstacles. Cape Breton quote from the Cape Breton Post, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the minister's using quotes from the Cape Breton Post yesterday. He also used a quote from the Cape Breton Post about the ICEAP at CBU, but that's not at CBU. It's in Glace Bay. So if the minister's going to use quotes about Cape Breton, he might want to get his facts straight. Mr. Speaker, the southern region of Nova Scotia suffered in the last year from 2,700 jobs exiting the workforce, while there's 1,700 lost jobs. 2,700 people exiting the workforce. Focusing on the symptoms of the problems without addressing the fundamental issues facing our province is bad public policy. When the minister neglects the fundamentals of competitiveness and proper planning, the result is being forced to pay corporations millions of dollars to stay afloat while thousands of jobs are still lost. Precisely the situation the government finds itself in now. Mr. Speaker, why is it that the only thing the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism seems to be able to do is react to shutdowns, yet is unable to address the fundamental employment crisis facing our rural communities?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to remind all members of the House that under this government, and I'll start with Lower Churchill, Mr. Speaker, a significant move by this government, Mr. Speaker, to create jobs within the province of Nova Scotia, and certainly a huge benefit to the Cape Breton region of this province. Mr. Speaker, ships start here. A huge contract which we were in from the very, very beginning with Irving Shipyard, and fortunately, we've got that contract. Mr. Speaker, we have created thousands of jobs in the province of Nova Scotia. We are going to stay the course. It's called Jobs Here, Mr. Speaker. Jobs here.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on his final supplementary.
jobs here, Mr. Speaker, that includes $400 million of taxpayers' money and no targets and no way to know how we reach that finish line in terms of creating jobs in this province. Mr. Speaker, the minister can talk all he wants about unemployment rates, but even if we compare the first 11 months of 2011 with the same period last year, there was a decline in average employment levels of 900 net jobs in all of Nova Scotia, coupled with a drop in labour supply, again, the labour force. The average unemployment rate on a year-to-year basis of the province is 9%. But it's only low because the labour supply contracted more quickly than we lost jobs. It's a pretty simple equation, Mr. Speaker. And let's be clear, when the labour supply and demand contract, there is nothing to celebrate for this government. The path towards growth is to say we want to create a range of new jobs, set up a competitive business environment, and put clear and measurable outcomes to accompany these targets. Yet this minister has avoided the hard work and difficult decisions required to success, and we see the results. 6,500 jobs lost and 8,200 people leaving the rural economy. Mr. Speaker, what will it take for this minister to understand that he needs a competitive and comprehensive plan to address the needs of rural Nova Scotia before it gets any worse?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism. Order, order, please. Order. Order. Order, please. Order, please. Order. Order, please. Order. I'll ask the honourable member to have order in the chamber this morning. That's inappropriate language in the chamber. Okay? The next time I will ask the honourable member to withdraw from the chamber if I hear that word spoken again today. The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, with that excitement, I almost lost track of what the question was. But I think the question was with respect to jobs in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I keep reminding members of this House that we have a strategic plan. Mr. Speaker, it is called Jobs Here, and what that plan is that plan is an inclusive plan. For the first time, Mr. Speaker, in 20 years, we've recognized the economic decline in this province, a province that was dead last, according to national statistics, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to economic growth. We are investing in people and in education. Mr. Speaker, this is the most inclusive plan that this province has seen in Nova Scotia in 20 years. It is called Jobs Here, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Health and Wellness. The Auditor General made clear in his report last May that wait lists for long-term care should be made public on the department's website, which is something that this party supports. By not allowing the wait list figures, growing as they are under the NDP, to be made public, Nova Scotians are not only struggling with the reality that there are too few long-term care beds, but they're also being denied some basic information to make some informed choices. And I know as MLAs, many of us get phone calls from families of seniors who are wondering where they are on the wait list. On October 2nd, 2008, the now Premier told the Kings County Register, and I have a copy of that, that he believes that, quote, wait lists are a smokescreen for a secret government practice born out of desperation. Mr. Speaker, those are very harsh words. So does the minister agree with the Premier that wait lists are a smokescreen for her government's secret practices and are born out of desperation?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the honourable member brings an issue to the floor that's very important to myself and to this government, and that's providing the right kind of health care for our seniors, particularly frail and vulnerable seniors with complex and multiple needs. We've added close to 1,000 new long-term care beds into the continuing care system. And in addition to that, we've also initiated a number of new programs designed to provide more support for caregivers and to seniors who want to remain in their own homes. We have continued to work very hard to monitor the wait times for long-term care and to look at ways to improve access to long-term care. And people in the province will be be hearing about some of the additional initiatives that we plan to put in place in the coming days, months and weeks, years, Mr. Speaker.
For Argyle on his first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her answer. Of course, the 1,000 beds are important, but we do need more beds in different parts of the province, so I hope that will continue. I'm aware of an amazing response given by the department to the Auditor General regarding the recommendation of making the wait list public. The Auditor General was told the department would make a business case for long-term care wait list information to be included within the larger wait list strategy for the department. That, Mr. Speaker, means something to somebody, but heaven help them, it doesn't do anything to meet the AG's recommendations, and it does nothing to help the growing list of families waiting for placement. So my question is this, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister. Will the Minister cut through the bureaucratic mumbo-jumbo and immediately abide by the AG's recommendations and make the information public to all Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I believe that on our website there is the latest assessment that the continuing care staff have done on wait times, and certainly there was a fair amount of information on this in the last number of weeks that we've been here in the House, Mr. Speaker. But as you know, waits change day by day, and the important thing, I think, is that we work very hard to understand what the pressures are, where they are, and how best to plan to deal with a growing number of seniors in our communities who require services. And that is the work that certainly I, the department, and this government are undertaking, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Argyle on his final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Today is a very special day for people in Nova Scotia. It's the day when everybody gets told by the Premier what he thinks the state of the province is. I can tell you, how can people eat with all that spinning going on? The Minister will know the true state of the province. No smokescreen, no NDP mumbo-jumbo, includes growing wait lists for long-term care beds, the cancellation by the NDP of further construction, and agonizing wait lists for seniors and families growing in numbers. So my question, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister, why won't this Minister stop patronising Nova Scotians and give the true state of the province to Nova Scotians, post the information demanded by the Auditor General, and let Nova Scotians decide for themselves just how unreliable the NDP have been about wait times?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much. Well, the only person whose information is unreliable is that member's, Mr. Speaker, because there has been no cancellation of long-term care beds. Mr. Speaker, we are about halfway through the continuing care strategy. There are still 4 to 6 years remaining in rolling out that strategy and building and adding additional beds into the system, Mr. Speaker, and that certainly is the intention of this minister and this government on a go-forward basis. Seniors who are vulnerable are at the top of our priority list in the Department of Health. We have a multiple number of initiatives underway to support seniors so they don't have to go to emergency departments, so they get the right care in the right place with the right providers as soon as possible, Mr. Speaker. And we are making great progress in terms of delivering good care to the seniors of this province.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Energy. Mr. Speaker, this past weekend it came to my attention that the state of New Hampshire is currently finalizing a deal with Hydro-Quebec to deliver energy beginning in 2014 and a second phase in 2016. It also came to my attention over the past few days that Rhode Island and Massachusetts are in the early stages of negotiating such agreements for the same timeline. Mr. Speaker, we already know Vermont has finalized a deal, and I believe that energy will be flowing very soon. You know, Mr. Speaker, in questioning in the past couple of weeks, the Premier has said that he's perfectly content to wait until Muskrat Falls is complete before holding such discussions with Hydro-Quebec. Yet other jurisdictions are all picking up the phone, calling Hydro-Quebec, and having those deals begin for 2016. So, Mr. Speaker, would the Minister of Energy please explain why his government is content to wait until Muskrat Falls is complete before picking up the phone to discuss the possibility of importing cheaper, clean Hydro-Quebec energy?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. Certainly, Nova Scotians, we're looking for the best possible sources of energy, the best rates for consumers, for ratepayers, and we're always looking at the various options that are available. We buy some power from outside the region right now, and certainly when the lower Churchill comes on stream, that will be stable rates for a 35-year period, clean, green, renewable energy, but our options are always open, looking for the best possible deal for ratepayers in our province.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, after a couple of weeks of asking almost the same question, do you think you'd get a better answer by this point with some detail? It's almost like the government is incapable of multitasking. The thing is, the minister will talk about cleaner, cheaper energy from Muskrat Falls, and of course, he probably knows that it's been reported in Newfoundland the price of that energy would be 16.54 cents a kilowatt hour in Newfoundland. We can assume that it might be higher here. We also know that it's only 8 to 10% at most of energy needs in Nova Scotia. And so it makes sense that we're going to need energy from other sources. We know that the deals currently being signed in the States are for delivery in 2016 and beyond, which is after the Muskrat Falls date. So, Mr. Speaker, if the Premier, when he answered the question last week, he said that they would consider getting that energy after Muskrat Falls. To do that, those deals need to be signed and the negotiations need to start today. So, Mr. Speaker, governments in the U.S. are picking up the phone and making that call. Why isn't the Minister of Energy doing the same thing?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I understand that, the need for the best deal for our ratepayers, and certainly that's what we're all interested in getting. But the truth is the infrastructure is just not there between Quebec and New Brunswick to come into Nova Scotia. The intertie between our two provinces is not updated, and and besides the rate that's being offered to other jurisdictions in North America, it's on a floating market price. They're still vulnerable to rising prices of fossil fuels, and those prices will no doubt continue to go up. And again, with the lower Churchill deal, once that full infrastructure is in place, that's going to allow us access to clean, green, renewable energy from other jurisdictions and in the best interest of ratepayers in our province.
The honourable member for Dartmouth on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, there'll be a lot of Canadians that will be surprised to learn that hydropower is subject to the price of fossil fuels on the world market. I think there's going to be a lot of shock about that, and if the minister actually believes that, he may want to stop saying that Churchill Falls will be stable energy, because that's hydropower too. Mr. Speaker, this is really simple. We're not asking the minister to sign a deal today. We're asking him to pick up the phone and explore the possibility of a deal. What we're telling him, he talks about the infrastructure, yet the Premier stood in this House last week and said that infrastructure tie will be done by the time Muskrat Falls is complete, and these deals are to take place and to deliver energy after Muskrat Falls is complete. So that infrastructure issue is irrelevant. Not only the fact that Hydro-Quebec has already said the infrastructure is already sufficient, and they looked into it. So, Mr. Speaker, the answers simply don't wash. So, Mr. Speaker, will the Minister of Energy pick up the phone and call Hydro-Quebec like his counterparts have in other jurisdictions and just see if the possibility of such a deal might exist for Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In our research, we've talked to the former system operator in the province of New Brunswick, Bill Marshall. He's indicated that the capacity is just not there at this point in time to bring in electricity from the province of Quebec, and again, there's no long-term price certainty, even if it is available. We do buy a little bit on the spot market as required in the winter months in particular, But again, the best deal for Nova Scotia is the Lower Churchill. It'll expand the transmission system. It'll allow for clean, green, renewable energy, and that too, in turn, will allow us to bring in more renewable energy from other sources once that's done.
Here, we got the honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice. The Youth Advocate Program offered a more personalized approach to reforming higher-risk youth. The program worked. The federal government extended pilot funding for an additional year, and this Nova Scotia success story is being advanced around the country as a way to divert higher-risk youth aged 9 to 14 from criminal behaviour. My question to the Minister, how are discussions going between this government and HRM to allocate funding to continue the program in 2012?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, and thank the member for the question. There's ongoing discussion with HRM. In fact, I had correspondence sent to the mayor. I signed off yesterday in continuing our support for them and to looking at ways to working together in a collaborative manner to enhance the quality of service. I want to also take the opportunity here to talk about our crime prevention initiatives that we're doing, and especially around the Lighthouse program that targets youth directly, and that the results from that, especially within the HRM area, has been very positive, and we look to continue. One of our most precious resources in our society is our youth.
The honourable member for Inverness on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the federal government fully funded this pilot program. They initiated and took the risk, and our province benefited. It costs $120,000 each year to incarcerate youth, and it costs about a fifth of that to turn these kids around with the Youth Advocate program. The program is saving the province money. This government needs to come forth and be forthright about what it's going to do. Why won't this government support something that is working for our most at-risk youth?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the question, and it gives me an opportunity to say unequivocally that as the Minister of Justice and as this government, we're committed to youth and looking at doing things differently and how we invest in youth. We see that as an initiative much superior to putting more people in jail, as the philosophy of the opposition's perspective is. So we believe in finding ways to prevent crime, to enhance the quality of life for our youth, unlike the Conservative agenda, which believes in putting more people in jail and building more jails.
The honourable member for Inverness on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I do take exception with the minister's comments because it was, after all, the Conservative government that funded this program. So there is less chance of children falling through the cracks and ruining their lives if only this government would stand up and help them. Will the minister help those young people see something more in themselves and keep our streets safer by assuring to this legislature that his government will keep this program alive?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
One of the unique things of this government versus the previous administration, they had a system of stovepipes where they didn't allow monies to go from one department to another. We have within social services, for example, they're doing the youth outreach and team commitment. We're looking at ways of how we work with the Department of Education with their health. So this government's approach to looking at youth is looking at it more in a holistic. Their approach to looking at it is they might give a token fund of some dollars, but they believe fundamentally of locking more people up, building more jails, and that's a fundamental difference between this government and the previous administration. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, currently the the fuel tax regulations, especially under regulations section 1227, 31C, 43 and 92, which I'm sure the minister can quote verbatim, certain activities are exempt from paying of the fuel tax, and certain activities pay the tax, have it rebated back to them, and other ones just simply don't pay it. Forestry, farming, fishing, and manufacturing activities of certain types are exempt or have the fuel tax rebated. However, of all the primary resource industries, mining and quarrying industries pay the full tax and are not eligible for a rebate. Mr. Speaker, has the Minister of Finance reviewed this regulation, and does he plan to exempt mining and quarrying from the fuel tax?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think all members of the House will be aware that this particular issue is one that's been raised this year by the Mining Association of Nova Scotia, and they've sought meetings with many members. I'm pleased to say that the Minister of Natural Resources and I had a meeting with representatives of the Mining Association on this particular issue, and it was a very good meeting, and whether something along those lines might be part of a budget, we'll just have to wait for the next provincial budget. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm glad the Minister and the Minister of Natural Resources met with the industry, but I don't think the industry necessarily wants to wait until spring, which would then put them into a whole other year. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the Minister is aware that Nova Scotia's fuel tax regulations as applied to mining and quarrying are actually unique in the country, and it puts Nova Scotia operations at a competitive disadvantage. And eliminating that, the payment of that tax would actually help level the playing field, at least on one of the issues in this sector of the economy. And to leave the matter unchanged only serves to be a discouragement for future mineral operations. So, Mr. Speaker, does the Minister of Finance plan to recommend to Cabinet an exemption for mining operations of this fuel tax?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, there is another aspect on which Nova Scotia is unique, and that is that some of the exemptions that are already offered are not offered in other provinces. So like most budget items, Mr. Speaker, it's a matter of balance, that if we're going to offer an exemption, which does, after all, represent a reduction in revenue in one sector, should we then change it to be more in line with the rest of the country in other sectors where we offer the exemption and the other provinces don't? This is the kind of balancing that takes place as part of the budget process, and we will certainly consider this proposal very carefully, along with all other proposals for revenue reductions as part of the budget process.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his final supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, but we listened to the Premier at the beginning of question period tell us about how rosy everything is in the economy now that the NDP is in government. So I'm quite sure that this must be fairly easy to solve, since everything is hunky-dory now that the NDP is government. You know, Mr. Speaker, the mining industry is directly or indirectly responsible for 6,300 jobs in this province. Most of those are in rural Nova Scotia, and adds $490 million to our provincial GDP. And I'm sure, having met with the mining industry, he's well aware that some of those costs that he rightly talks about can be captured back through the increased growth in the industry and increased taxes that would be generated by increased investment and the increase in jobs that would come with it. Mr. Speaker, this is about jobs, and it's an industry that's in just about every constituency in the province, including many of the urban constituencies such as my own. Mr. Speaker, if the Minister does not want to see more of these jobs go west, what steps is he prepared to take to improve the competitiveness of this industry compared to other provinces?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, part of our discussion with the Industry Association was precisely along the lines of that there are multiple dimensions to the economics of the mining industry. And taxation, and particularly taxation on fuel, is only one, and I think the Mining Association agreed with us. It's actually a very small factor. There are other factors, such as the biggest one, of course, being the world price of the minerals that can actually be found in Nova Scotia, along with exchange rates, since much of our production is exported. Environmental regulations and environmental assessments are another important factor in the development of any mine. And so we'll continue to work with the industry, as we always have, Mr. Speaker, as previous governments have, to make sure that that the industry is as productive and as it can possibly be. So this particular item of the fuel tax exemption is one piece of a much larger puzzle, and we will consider that proposal as part of the budget process.
The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Mr. Speaker, child and spousal support payments in this province are $80 million in arrears, and for the most part, women and children are feeling the brunt of it. In fact, 95% of these cases involve children. It's hard enough for families in this province to make ends meet with the tax on fuel, power rates through the roof, let alone being short support monies owed to them. Now, we've heard about one new investigator being assigned to the maintenance enforcement program, but that's it. That's it. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice. What is the rest of his plan to make sure these families get these court-ordered maintenance payments as soon as possible?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for that question. That's a good question. And this government is committed. And I just want to acknowledge that last year we collected over 60 million for families in regards to this program. This initiative is very important to me personally, and the disarray of it by taking this over 2.5 years ago. We do see the complexities in this issue. One of the major barriers to success in putting resources and money back into families is when someone leaves the province. And so we're trying to work in a collaborative manner with other jurisdictions across the country to see how we take down barriers. This is not something that will be accomplished overnight, but I want to assure the member that I am working diligently on that issue, that I am committed 100%. And as I said in my previous question, there is nothing more important to me than our youth. I see that that's a strategic investment for the future for all of us and the quality of life for families, because we are a government and a party that put families first.
The Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his heartfelt answer. However, the 9,000 maintenance payments owed to families in Nova Scotia are no small change. In May of this year, there were 2,200 cases where they were owed in excess of $10,000. There were 231 cases where they were owed in excess of $50,000. Mr. Speaker, these are house payments missed, power bills unpaid, bills in collection. The people who work in maintenance enforcement program are skilled and dedicated to their work, but they simply cannot meet the demands of this understaffed, under-resourced program. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice once again. Will he assure this House that he will ensure the maintenance enforcement program will be sufficiently funded and staffed so that families get the monies legally owed to them?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. I am committed 100%, as I said before. That doesn't waver. I want to point out, too, that we've increased compliance by 10% from the previous year. We've reduced arrears by 25 million. And if the member is looking for a total satisfaction within the system overnight, that's not going to happen. We have to be realistic. We're actively committed, but I'm also hearing the member to saying that to hire more people and to put more money. The difference between the opposition party and this government is that we believe in having a strategic focus in managing our dollars and trying to put resources in place to accomplish things in a very clear manner. And our results from the previous years is showing that progress. And so I do make that distinction between the opposition wishing to hire more people, spend more dollars, and not accomplish what we're doing today.
The Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Minister would be well aware that a good chunk of that $25 million that they collected was in fact write-offs of debts that were no longer owed.
Shame on that minister for writing off that money to go to children and women in this province.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Maintenance Enforcement Program is piloting a program where the equivalent of one full-time investigator is responsible for tracking down delinquent payers. Now, if this government was truly committed to strengthening the maintenance program, it would offer more than one investigator who has to track down over 9,000 payers and over $80 million in arrears. In fact, it would take that one investigator working 50 weeks a year, solving one case a day, over 30 years to solve just the current cases, not any new ones. Now that pre-budget preparations are underway, will the minister tell members of this House whether or not he has asked or will ask the Minister of Finance to ensure funding to strengthen the maintenance enforcement program in the next budget?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much for the question. I want to also highlight that our staff is actively enforcing the areas of arrears. We're looking at every case that's being reviewed. We're trying to establish the most predominant cases that need the most attention and putting in a systematic approach We're also looking at things such as revoking driver's license and looking at the passport. So there are steps that are doing there. Mr. Speaker, I do want to make the separation between the opposition and what I see as a leadership issue in this government. This government is committing to putting in a strategic plan and being systematic about our approach. The opposition's approach to this is hire a whole bunch more people, put all kinds of money, and the ills of society will go away. They're forgetting that we have a structural deficit in this province, and unless they get that understanding, this province won't have a good opposition.
The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. In the past, contracts established with home oxygen providers were based on what government was willing to pay for the service. If a company was able to honour the one price government was willing to pay and meet the terms for service in one district, two districts, or all of the districts for that matter, they expressed their interest in doing so. They were added to the vendors list. In April 2011, this NDP government changed the process. The end result? A hodgepodge of prices paid by government and a severe disruption to over half of the home oxygen clients who depend on this service. My question to the Minister, what problem was government attempting to solve by changing the method in which home oxygen vendors were added to a vendor list?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we had a very fair, transparent process to award tenders for home oxygen. Prior to going to tender, my department looked at what was occurring across the country. We identified that in Nova Scotia we were paying a significant higher amount of money for this service, and through the tendering process we've been able to ensure that people who require these services get these services, but at a reduced cost, Mr. Speaker, to the taxpayer of the province. Thank you.
The honourable member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Well, I have to tell you, Mr. Speaker, the so-called fixing of problems that don't exist has become a hallmark of this government. If government was interested in saving money, they could have told all vendors to meet a fixed price set by government and then allow companies to make a business decision as to whether they would be interested in meeting what government was willing to pay. Mr. Speaker, Family First Medical, a homegrown Nova Scotia success story, was forced to reduce its payroll by $304,000 as a result of changes to the home oxygen tender process. 7 dedicated employees lost their job at Family First. 4 more employees had their hours reduced. 2 others agreed to a wage cut. We are aware, Mr. Speaker, that another vendor had to lay off 3 employees. Mr. Speaker, this government can't blame international forces for these job losses. They can only blame themselves. My question to the Minister, did the Minister factor in job losses and their impact on government finances when calculating savings on the home oxygen contract?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, as I indicated, we had a very fair tendering process for these services. The company the honourable member refers to, in fact, were the successful proponents in at least 3 DHAs where the contracts were awarded, Mr. Speaker. So I'm satisfied with the process that we followed. I'm particularly satisfied that there was no disruption in service for people who require home oxygen, and additionally I'm very satisfied that we're able to get realize value for dollar in the healthcare system, something that party doesn't seem to get.
The honourable member for Kings West on his final supplement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Maybe today is not the time to go into the disruption that actually did take place. But, Mr. Speaker, it seems everything this government touches results in job losses. 97% of the 103 home oxygen clients in the Valley were served by Family First Medical, headquartered in New Minas. After government was finished, we had a Nova Scotia business which had to lay off staff, 103 clients in the Valley who had to leave a company they loved all for the purpose of giving a Manitoba company a foothold in this province. This makes no sense to Nova Scotians, especially when government could have saved money by simply following a process that has been followed in this province for years. Why was it more important for the minister and her government to support a company from Manitoba over a homegrown Nova Scotia company?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I think the answer is in the member's question. This government are not prepared to do business the way it's been done for years, Mr. Speaker. We know where that has got us in terms of not only the state of the healthcare system, but the state of the province's finances, Mr. Speaker. The company in the Valley was successful in the tender in 3 DHAs in the province, Mr. Speaker. It was a fair and open and transparent process. It has resulted in value for dollar for the taxpayer of the province and the continuation of services for people who require those services, Mr. Speaker, and I don't think it gets any better than that.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on a new question.
Well, it's a new question, Mr. Speaker, but it's going to have the same theme, and accountability and transparency is what it's all about. Should be paramount in any government's agenda. In April of this year, government changed the tender process for home oxygen services from a process where clients could choose a vendor based on the company who provided the best service to one where customer choice is restricted. Vendor decisions were decided by government using an arbitrary scoring process. Mr. Speaker, I would like to table a FOIPOP which shows that RANA, a Manitoba-based company which became a provider for the first time in the home oxygen program's 10 years existence, scored the highest number of points. Given that 80 of the possible 105 points were based in part on criteria such as resource management and service delivery risk, my question is, how did a company with no service experience, one small office in Dartmouth, and at the time of the tender possessed very little staff, score the highest number of points?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much. Well, the scoring of points, Mr. Speaker, is part of the tendering process, which is undertaken by staff in the department. The criteria are well established in advance of the tendering process. The companies that bid on these tenders are aware of what the criteria are because it's set out in the call for proposals, Mr. Speaker. I am very satisfied that we had a fair, transparent, and open process. And in terms of client choice, Mr. Speaker, we arranged for the change in the way we were delivering home oxygen in a way to ensure that there is choice for clients in every DHA, in that there were 2 companies awarded the contracts per DHA, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I note with interest that there was a part of the RFP that asked client satisfaction with service delivery, yet 0 points were awarded for this criteria. Wouldn't one think those vendors who have been operating for years in Nova Scotia would have an advantage, and those who weren't would be at a disadvantage, yet 0 points awarded? Mr. Speaker, this particular contract is in place for 2 years, possibility of an extension of an additional 2 years. When clients are unsatisfied with one vendor, they are limited as to their choice of who else they can turn to, and they are stuck with limited choices for perhaps as many as 4 years. Given that the minister is committed to quality patient care and does have the ability to reintroduce a tender process where she can dictate a lower price, not vendors, will the minister be going back to a process where service and choice will once again become paramount in the home oxygen program?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And certainly we're always very interested and very concerned if our patients, our consumers, are dissatisfied with the services that we're providing, and I would like to tell members of this House that with respect to home oxygen services in the 2.5 years I've been Minister of Health, I don't believe I've had one letter, call, or email expressing dissatisfaction on the part of a client with those services.
The honourable member for Kings West.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Minister. That's exactly why there was no need to change the process. People were satisfied. A Nova Scotia company was prospering. Mr. Speaker, the Atlantic Home respiratory providers have expressed concern to this government. Home oxygen clients have undergone unnecessary service disruptions and are now limited on who they can switch to when they have concerns. All of this was unnecessary, especially when government could have achieved similar savings through the process that has been in place for years. And watch with certainty, Mr. Speaker, the same thing will happen to the nurses' uniform contract. My question to the Minister, would the Minister confirm whether Manitoba-based RANA actually approached government with a proposal to provide home oxygen services for the entire province, and this new process is merely the first step?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thought I was fairly clear in the first answer that I laid out with respect to why we went to a tendering process. Mr. Speaker, we looked at what other provinces are paying for home oxygen. We realized that in Nova Scotia we were paying higher rates, that we did not have a competitive rate in this province that gave good value to the taxpayer of the province. We determined that going to tender might address the situation to get better value for the taxpayer, for the Department of Health. Service was very high at the top of our list. We wanted to ensure that there would be choice. So we did it in a way so that there would be choice in each DHA by awarding 2 companies the tender at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker. So people do have choice. So it was a win-win situation. We got better value for dollar, and patients continue to get the services, and they have choice, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development, or should we call it rural devastation? Mr. Speaker, today the Premier will attempt to describe the state of her province. I don't think his speechwriters will remember to include all of the advice from the women and men who are the job creators in this province. I doubt the spin doctors will choose to remember that these people, the ones who know how to create jobs, universally advised NDP not to proceed with a law which imposes involuntary contracts, because it'll scare away investments to create new jobs and reinvestments to keep existing jobs. So my question, will the Minister please remind the Premier's speechwriters about the sorry state of our province, whose government ignores the advice of job creators, small and large, many of whom have infinitely more job-creating experience than this Minister or any member of the government?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this minister has great confidence not only in the Premier of the province of Nova Scotia, but also in all of the staff that not only that work in his office, but also with respect to his communications people. I've got the utmost confidence in them, and there's little advice that I could offer them, and I would say there's no advice that the member opposite could offer them.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes on his first supplementary.
You know, Mr. Speaker, I look up and down the NDP benches and I shake my head. I see pathetically little job-creating experience. I do see some earnest people who've done some interesting things in their lives, maybe hired a few people, but I don't see much by the way of people who have put everything on the line and created more than the odd job. Now you would think, Mr. Speaker, that a government so weird and lacking that critical experience would listen to those who do. But instead, they listen to Rick Clerk and a handful of career Labour politicians. What a sorry state this province is in, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Minister, does the Minister agree that a government which lacks experience creating jobs must listen to and take advice from Nova Scotians who have that experience?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
You know, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I understand the tone from the member opposite. The reason I understand the tone, Mr. Speaker, is because I know that for 20 years, Mr. Speaker, that there's been economic neglect in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I stand here and I say, as many Nova Scotians say, Mr. Speaker, thank goodness there's an NDP government. Thank goodness there's a government that understands the economic conditions of the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, thank goodness that there's an economic government here that recognizes Lower Churchill, ship start here, jobs in the economy, Mr. Speaker. For the first time in 20 years, we've got a government that finally understands and gets it.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, a government with such puny experience in a key area is dangerous. That's one awful state for this province to be in, Mr. Speaker. No wonder they've lost more jobs in rural Nova Scotia than will ever be created by the federal ship contract. Where are all the jobs the NDP promised, committed to, whatever? Nowhere. In the words of Lenin, not that Lenin, this minister is nowhere, man. He don't know what he's missing. So I ask the minister, is he as blind as he can be to the reality that he just sees what he wants to see?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
You know, Mr. Speaker, it doesn't surprise me that we hear name-calling from the member opposite. That comes as no surprise to me, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know this is question period, but I'm curious. This weekend, there's a rally going on. And you know what? It's about saving jobs in Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know,
Order, please. Order. Order. The Honourable Minister for Economic and Rural Development and Tourism, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I was saying, there's a rally this weekend in Cape Breton. It's about saving 102 federal jobs, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to wonder out loud, Mr. Speaker, I wonder how many members from that opposite party will be at that rally.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do hope that whoever goes, the Minister of Development will obviously be there from this tone. So, my question today, Mr. Speaker, is to the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, over a year ago, government announced they would fund Lucentis. However, funding is only covered if treatment was received in Halifax. When the announcement was made, Mr. Speaker, a caveat was attached, and that caveat being the program would eventually be expanded to other clinics in the province. Mr. Speaker, Cape Breton District Health Authority purchased the necessary equipment. They had a retinal specialist until he retired, and they certainly have their fair share of patients traveling to Halifax. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister, how much longer will the residents in Cape Breton needing Lucentis have to travel to Halifax?
Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for raising a very important question. It gives me an opportunity to tell members of the House that indeed providing this service in Cape Breton is a priority for the government. We have lost the specialist in Cape Breton who we had anticipated would be able to help us roll this program out there. The training of ophthalmologists is now our second approach to this, and we are working diligently to get that in place so indeed people from Cape Breton won't have to travel to Halifax, and we hope to have that done at the earliest possible opportunity, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton South on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the same number of patients who meet the program criteria will not change simply by expanding the program in Cape Breton or other parts of the province, for that matter. Prior to government funding, retinal specialists did not have the monopoly on injecting Lucentis. Ophthalmologists were and still are injecting for individuals in Cape Breton and other places with private insurance. They just can't inject and receive payment from this NDP publicly funded program. So, Mr. Speaker, the way I see it, the province has two potential scenarios from which to choose. They can either establish clinics in the far ends of the province and have retinal specialists travel, or they can expand injection rights to other specialists who have been injecting all along and allow them to provide the service in a variety of communities now across Nova Scotia. My question to the Minister, which of these two scenarios does the Minister prefer?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, as I indicated, we are working to address the situation because we are very committed to having in place a program so that people who require these services in the Cape Breton area do not have to travel to Halifax.
The honourable member for Cape Breton South on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, that would be easy to do if they would allow other specialists to inject Lucentis patients in Cape Breton now, not sometime in the future. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia was the last province to announce they would fund Lucentis, so they had all sorts of other potential delivery options and models from which to choose. Mr. Speaker, when New Brunswick announced their program, they granted certain specialists in certain communities to be injectors under the publicly funded program. Others have programs where specialists travel to areas outside of a central clinic site to provide services. And Mr. Speaker, I have to tell you, when people have to make an appointment for Halifax and they have to travel and don't have the means to do so, and their sight is deteriorating rapidly, the decision becomes very tough. The Minister's decision, Mr. Speaker, is easy by comparison. My final question to the Minister, Mr. Speaker, when will the Minister make a decision to ensure that the residents of Cape Breton are able to access Lucentis treatments at Cape Breton and provide them with equal service to those receiving that service in Halifax?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when we announced the Lucentis coverage, we announced that it would be provided through retinal specialists. All of the retinal specialists were here and are here in the Capital District Health Authority, with one exception. There was one retinal specialist in Cape Breton who I believe was getting close to retirement and did not work full-time. That gentleman has since retired. Ophthalmologists, although they are very capable individuals, are not retinal specialists, and we are working to address the question of delivering Lucentis in the safest and most beneficial way to the people of Cape Breton who require this service, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Recently, I asked the Minister of Health about cutbacks to the mobile breast screening program. Instead of answering the question, she chimed in with comments about an open public meeting on Lyme disease residents of my constituency were demanding, and her department has refused to address. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to table a request I made for the minister to come to a public meeting on Lyme disease, and I will also table her response declining the invitation. Mr. Speaker, 140 residents attended that meeting, I have to say, and I would also like to point out that I don't think this minister has any room to criticize a meeting when she is responsible for the health and well-being of my constituents, and it was she who refused to speak to the residents in the first place. Moreover, she must have been aware of the meeting and did not indicate any concerns when she replied to the Residents Association organizing this meeting via her deputy. I'll table that. Previously, when I had told her the communication that her staff at Capitol Health said it wasn't in their communication strategy to conduct public meetings on Lyme disease, her response, quote, was, "I certainly don't direct them on how to conduct their business in that regard." Mr. Speaker, how can the minister be so critical of a public meeting when she was given the right of first refusal and did just that, refused?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in trying to be constructive on an important topic like Lyme disease, I did have an opportunity to meet with, at my request, some specialists from the Queen Elizabeth who work in infection control. And these are people who are infection control specialists. They are people who do research, but also have very active clinical practices. And they are the people that family doctors across the province, in fact, are able to make referrals to and get information from. And my department is very, very active in monitoring where Lyme disease is occurring around the province, helping family doctors to improve their ability to diagnose Lyme disease and to follow up with treatment. And I would offer an opportunity to the honourable member from across the way to meet with the infection control physicians at the Queen Elizabeth. They are very well informed, and they still have their medical licenses, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would invite the minister to step outside and make that same statement about the doctor in question who was at that particular meeting, because then she will face civil consequences. She should check and make sure about what she has said about that particular doctor. Mr. Speaker, it's a fact that as long as the weather remains warm, ticks are still prevalent. In fact, ticks are most active in the spring and fall months. They remain active until we experience consistently cold weather. This fact, Mr. Speaker, was articulated by Natural Resources staff to participants of a closed meeting which I attended in my riding back in June 2009, where there were, in fact, infectious disease specialists from Capitol Health. I note with interest that the Chief Medical Officer of New Brunswick reminded residents there of this fact on November 9th, a month ago. And what have we heard from this government? Nothing. My question, why does the Minister of Health continue to ignore the potential impact of black-legged ticks can have on the health and well-being of the residents of Bedford and Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I know the research to the official opposition is sometimes a bit shaky, and but perhaps I'd like to go back and check that at least 1 or 2 Fridays ago, my department put out a media advisory on the identification of black-legged ticks in another part of our province, Mr. Speaker. We are very, very active, as I said, in providing surveillance, information to the public, Mr. Speaker. And this is an issue that Dr. Bob Strang and other members of the department, through the chief medical officers in the various DHAs, follow very carefully, Mr. Speaker. There are communications with and through Doctors Nova Scotia to the physicians of the province occur on a regular basis, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, again, I would like to offer the honourable member an opportunity to meet with some of the infection control specialists from the province who practice in the province, who are very much on top of this issue and could help enlighten the honourable member on the state of Lyme disease in the province and the diagnosis and the treatment of Lyme disease.
The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will be most happy to meet with those experts. I hope they're not the same ones that told one of my constituents that her Lyme disease was all in her head. And, Mr. Speaker, I would point out that the particular news release the minister mentioned was about the identification procedure for ticks. It had nothing to do with the fact that ticks are still active in the colder months, in November, in December, and they missed the boat on that. Mr. Speaker, it is this minister's responsibility to warn residents that people can still be bitten by black-legged ticks, even as late as December. And Mr. Speaker, I was at Thanksgiving dinner, and people are outside running around, and they're saying, we don't have to worry about ticks anymore. It's Thanksgiving. They're not still active. They're still active at Thanksgiving. So, Mr. Speaker, we heard nothing from this minister. Crickets. My question, when will she get around to informing Nova Scotians that ticks are still active in Nova Scotia? Thank you.
The Honourable Member, Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, that member is certainly ticked off, and ticks may not be the only thing that is active in Nova Scotia, I think, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, Lyme disease is a serious matter for people who have Lyme disease. My department conducts very active surveillance of tick activity around the province. We issued...
Order, please, order. The time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers expired. I will now recognize the honourable member for Hants West on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to welcome today and introduce to the House our grade 11-12 law class from Windsor, which is the Evanview High School. Maybe as I call your name, I'll get you to stand and receive the warm welcome of this House, and I'll do that quickly, Mr. Speaker. Their teacher, Mr. Sheldon States, and the kids in the class, Amos Abedi, Logan Blackwood, Nicholas Bonang, Christine Boone, Jesse Campbell, Tegra Dominito, Alana Dukes, Marshall Gordon, Kelsey Harvey, Marissa Hazel, Mallory Henry, Victoria Langan Kennedy, Alyssa Loisel, Kimberly McCartney, Samantha McCullough, Connor McNeil, Dustin Moore, Kyle Reynolds, Courtney Riley, Jasmine Smith, and Kendra Trimper. Welcome to the House this morning. I hope you've enjoyed the proceedings so far. We're going to debate a couple of bills here in a few minutes. So, Mr. Speaker, with that, I would wish the members of the House to give them a warm welcome here to the legislature this morning.
We welcome all our guests to the gallery and hope that they enjoyed this morning's procedures. I will now recognize the House Leader for the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. Can you call private members' public bills for second reading?
Private member public bills for second reading. The Honourable Leader of the House Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Can you call bill number 68?